Self-regulation are a set of skills that help us plan and organize our behavior, help us select and pursue goals, and also helps us monitor and evaluate our progress. So they're a very broad set of behaviors that are important for everything. They're important in schools, they're important in playground, they're important in succeeding later in life. And so what we do in my lab is we look at, as Dan said, kids who are experiencing adversity. And we want to know what makes a difference. What makes a difference? Why some kids, despite being homeless or coming from low-income families, do well in life. And it turns out that there are a set of skills underlying self-regulation called executive functions. And these set of skills, there's basically 3 different set of skills, really help children regulate their attention, their behavior, and their emotion. And there are 3 things. One is inhibitory control. These are your abilities to suppress impulsive thoughts, ignore distractions and temptations, like in the video that we just saw. So you're suppressing that temptation to eat that one marshmallow, because if you just wait a little longer, you're going to have 2, right? And that is better than having only 1. The other set of skills is this working memory. This is your ability to hold information. It can be verbal or nonverbal. You hold it and you do something with it in your head, right? And that's helpful for multitasking, for finishing all kinds of multi-step procedures. And the last set of skills is cognitive flexibility. This is ability to really shift between different responses, different mental sets, different mental rules, seeing almost the same thing from 2 different perspectives. And so before we go in and telling you why we care, why this matter, I'm going to ask Jenna to tell you a little bit more about how we measure this set of skills and maybe even give you a little try.
So there's a few different ways that we can measure these skills. The first is that we can ask parents and teachers to report on kids' behaviors. And so we can ask them different questions about how impulsive a child might be, how well they follow directions, and they can rate it from 1 to 5. But as you can imagine, those measures might be biased by their experiences with other children, maybe how that child compares to their siblings or their classmates, or just the types of things that the teacher sees and misses. Maybe they don't see them on the playground as much engaging these skills. So in our lab, what we like to use are standardized tasks to measure executive functions. And so there's a few different ways to do this. One way is to play a game, such as Simon Says. And so if Simon says to do something, then you do it. And if Simon doesn't say it, you say, just touch your head. The child's supposed to not touch their head. We can also do tabletop tasks using different cards and pencils. And what we specifically use are computerized tasks. And the real benefit of this is that we can capture both how well kids do on it, but also how quickly that they can respond. And so to give you a sense of this, I'm going to show you one task that we've used in our lab in a sample of 3rd through 5th graders. And it's called the Hearts and Flowers task. And so in the Hearts and Flowers task, the first game is the heart game. And what we do is we ask children to press on the same side as the heart. And so I'm going to let you have a try. I want everyone to imagine they have a computer or a tablet in front of them. You have 2 fingers, and you're going to press on the side, same side as the heart. Great. So how challenging was that? Not so bad, right? So not so bad. So then we give them the next task. We say, OK, don't worry about the hearts anymore. Now you're going to press on the opposite side of the flower. And so they've just been practicing, and they get way more trials than that. They've been doing a ton of hearts. They've gotten used to it. Suddenly we say, forget your old rule. You have to press on the opposite side of the flower. OK, you ready to try? This is where it starts going downhill for me. OK, who missed some? OK, so then we say, well, now we have 2 different games. We've got the hearts game and the flowers game, and we're going to mix them. And so this is the really challenging part, and this requires the cognitive flexibility. You have to switch, remember which game it is, and then which side you're going to press. And it actually, for the children, goes much faster. So I'm going to show you an example of that task. Don't worry if you missed some. So that's one task we do, and we have several other ones that we use. And we're able to, again, measure how well they do on the task, but also how quickly they can respond. Great, I'll let you turn it over to Jelena.
So now you're probably wondering, why in the world would this matter, right? And so what we find and what other people find as well is that these EFs, these executive functioning skills, are basically building blocks of many childhood competencies. So they matter both for academic and cognitive development. We know that children who come to schools with these set of skills are a lot better to pay attention. They're a lot better at following the rules. They're more likely to engage, know how to sit still, raise your hand if you need to ask. So they can really engage in a school setting from the get-go. They're also really important for working skills, staying on task, collaborating with others, engaging with your friends. And they also translate to very specific math and reading and literacy skills, because you're able, for example, if you have a problem on math, you're not stuck in kind of constantly doing and applying wise strategy. You can inhibit that kind of dominant response, oh, I solve it only this way, and kind of think and flexibly shift and kind of incorporate other strategies. So they're really important for academic and cognitive development. The other thing that they're really important is they're really important playground. So kids who have better set of executive functioning skills, they're better at regulating their emotions. They're better at tolerating their frustrations when they get upset. They don't immediately lash out. They stop themselves, they inhibit those impulsive behaviors, and they can think through with their working memory about what are some alternative strategies, and then they can implement those. And so that leads to better peer acceptance, better social skills, and a better relationship with peers. And so one of the studies that we did in my lab is we looked at the kindergartners. We looked at the kindergartners at the beginning of the kindergarten, at the end of the kindergarten, and then in first grade. And we measured a lot of things. We asked them, we asked their parents, we asked their teachers. We wanted to know what their set of skills they have when they start kindergarten in terms of their inattention and impulsivity, which is lacking those executive functioning skills. We wanted to know how much conflict they experience with teachers, and we wanted to know how engaged they are. How much do they like school? How much do they want to go to school? And we find that all of three of these domains are really important. And they're really important, and they predict how kids feel at the end of the kindergarten. They also predict how their kids' experiences in the first grade. But we wanted to know which domains spill over to affect other domains. So what we find is that consistently, kids who start kindergarten with impulsivity and inattention and inability to regulate their behavior, they're experiencing more conflict with their teachers by the end of that school year. And they're also experiencing more conflict in the first grade. So we see this directional effect of lacking these set of skills increases your conflict with the teachers, which is really important. The teacher is really important, as all of you know. That relationship, that bond, can really set you on a different educational trajectory early on. The other thing that we find is the kids who come with low executive functioning, by the end of the kindergarten and in the first grade, they like school less. They're less engaged. They less want to go to school. So it's not that we're saying that executive functioning are important for everything and the only thing that are important, but at critical moments, they can set kids on a different trajectories because they either undermine other protective factors like that relationship with teachers or liking schools, and they put kids at risk for educational failure or not engaging in school. We also done a study with the homeless kids who are really at the end of the spectrum in terms of disadvantage. And we find when we measure what we would think in resilience research, like main protective factors like parenting quality and exposure to adversity, their IQ, we find that actually these set of skills are really the most important predictor of who does well and who is struggling. And these are, again, 4 to 6-year-olds. And we find that these set of skills don't only predict teacher reports of academic achievement, but also teacher reports of social competence and behavior, as well as their well-being, their mental health. So we see that these set of skills are especially important in at-risk populations. Now, unfortunately, what we also know is that kids who come from impoverished backgrounds also have lower levels of these set of skills. And so what this step graph shows it's a research done by our colleagues, is that for every year that you spend in poverty, so 0, 1, 2, and 3, these are 4-year-olds, okay? They are 4-year-olds, they're assessed on executive function skills at age 4. So for every additional year that you spend in poverty, your executive function skills are lower, okay? The other thing that I want to show you is this, these are children ages 10 to 18, and this is the measure of working memory as a function of their parents' education. Okay, so not income, but parents' education. And you can see this is 16 years of education, this is 14 years of education, and this is just high school. And you can see these very persistent gaps between ages of 10 to 18. So we know that these set of skills are really important at-risk context, and yet we know that experiences of a risk and adversity undermines development of these set of skills and creates these gaps. And another thing I want to tell you is how that happens. So one of the things that we know is that children in poverty experience a lot of stress, and they have a lot of their stress hormones, their body reacts. Something that we study in our lab that I'm not going to talk a lot about today is stress physiology, how different children react to these stressors in a different way. And we know that when children experience a lot of stress and those hormones get elevated, their brains get flooded with those hormones. And the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain that is in front, that's the most important part for executive functioning, gets affected by those hormones. And so what we see is when we compare children from low income and high income backgrounds, if you look at this top, picture of the brains, you can see that low-income children show greater activation of their brain. They're thinking harder on an easy task than the high-income kids. But when you look at the more difficult task over here, and they show less activation. So there is more blue than red when it's harder tasks. So we are already seeing not just behavioral differences, but we are also seeing how their brains are functioning when they're asked to do these tasks. Now, let's switch to the better side of the story. What can we do? What can we do to support development of these set of skills? Well, my lab and others have looked at two different aspects of a home environment. We also study classroom environments, and that's something maybe we can talk about in Q&A. But two different aspects is, one is if we surround children with stimulation in their homes, we're reading to them, we send them to high-quality childcare, we invest in educational toys and experiences, we know that these set of experiences really promote executive functioning. We also know that parental scaffolding, that engagement with the child where you're supporting their autonomy, you are supporting their language development, you're redirecting their attention, you're helping them focus, those are another set of skills that help. And so we partner with a colleague at Harvard to look at, to test this in a rural Pakistan, so very, very impoverished region where a majority of mothers never attended school, they're illiterate, they're high risk of maternal depression. And we looked at the 4-year-olds. We wanted to know, could we start a birth cohort and could we have some intervention that would make a difference? So my colleague Aisha Yousafzai has this ingenious intervention that was administered by community health workers in mothers' homes. And so they went into mothers' home and they really focused on activities to help that play and a communication between mom and a child to support sensitive and responsive caregiving, but also to help them learn how can they use simple toys like a spoon and a bowl or a little doll or a little ball that you kind of create with like materials that you have at home to stimulate the thinking of the 0 to 2-year-olds. So really, really early on. And so it was a home visitation program that also focused on observation and coaching, and then there was some feedback through community groups. And what we found when we followed these kids at age 4, we collaborated on a age 4 follow-up, we showed that responsive stimulation, this intervention, really improved the home environment of these kids. The environment was more stimulating. And we also show when we observed and directly measured maternal scaffolding, we showed that improved maternal scaffolding. What was really exciting to us in this paper is that we found effects of this intervention at age 4, even though our intervention ended at age 2. So intervention had a long-term effects. We also found that responsive stimulation was affecting executive functioning directly. And so it was both of these, the effects of these, of intervention through maternal scaffolding and through a home environment. Not only did it change the home environment, but it directly affected executive functioning at age 4. So we know that with this kind of light touch intervention, that it's embedded through their health system, we can improve these set of skills for these children. And now the children are followed up to see, are they better ready and are they succeeding in the school more? The other thing that we've done here in the US, actually in the Bay Area, we wanted to see how parents and children work together to achieve that regulation together. So we were interested at this co-regulation, right? Because it's okay, all the kids misbehave, all the kids are inattentive, all the kids are distracted, but we wanted to know, what do parents do in those moments? So as long as one of the dyad stayed regulated, or parents stayed in control, that was good, that was okay. Kids misbehave, right? But if the parents can respond to that. So we measure second-to-second interactions in a lab between the parent and the child. And what we found out is these micro-dynamic measures of parent-child co-regulation later predicted how teachers reported how well those kids were behaving, how well they were showing self-regulation in the classroom. So there's a lot of these micro-experiences. Which brings me to the next point. We often focus on lack of self-regulation. We always focus on children needing to regulate their emotion when they are experiencing anger or sadness or frustration. We're so focused. That's when we want our kids to really know how to control their behavior, their attention, their emotions, right? But the best place to practice these set of skills on an everyday is when they're experiencing exuberance and positive energy. Because imagine, even in those situations, you get to exercise self-regulation. And so I want to leave you with something more concrete so you can tell your grandkids or your kids in terms of what you can do on every day that you can actually improve these set of skills. So when you think about infancy, a lot of us do peekaboo games, right? Hiding games. So you think like, it's just a hiding game. What does it have to do with executive functioning? But you're following sequences. You're learning to manage that suspense, right? You're hiding and then you're waiting, right? That's a lot of self-regulation early on for the babies. When you do Itsy Bitsy Spider, there's tons of executive functioning getting practice because you know you're waiting for your reaction, you're following a sequence, there's a lot of repetitions, right? So it's just play. But it's still exercising these very, very important set of skills that later predicts how well they're going to do in schools. We're focusing early childhood, but there's science showing that they matter in adulthood as well. Preschool. What do preschool kids like to do? Role play, right? They like to pretend. Well, what is pretend play even doing something for them? It's doing an enormous amount. When you pretend play, you have to hold and update very complex rules and scripts. What are you pretending to be? What is your partner pretending to be? What if your play partner adjusts things? Can you flexibly not just stick with your one rule? Can you adjust to that? Can you adjust to those ideas? Can you repurpose banana and pretend it's a phone? Can you control your impulses to act out when it's not your turn? So there's a lot of executive functioning happening during preschool. When kids come to elementary schools, they engage in different kind of plays, board games and puzzles, and those games also exercise turn-taking, strategy, taking other people's perspective, collaborating, physical activities, dancing and cooking. All of these things have certain set of rules and processes where you have to monitor yourself and figure out where you are in that sequence, and you have to respond flexibly. And then all ages, we engage in conversations. And to engage in really meaningful, active listening, it requires you to sustain attention, to ignore those distractions, right? Storytelling, holding and updating and manipulating and organizing that information to tell a good story. Or even just developing your everyday routines like planning and goal setting and self-monitoring. And then my favorite one that I think kind of comes almost at no cost to a lot of our low-income families is the bilingual experience. So if you're learning 2 languages, first you have to practice your inhibitory control to stop yourself from using a certain language in a wrong environment, right? And then you have to be cognitively flexible to shift from very early age to tell that certain thing is called one way in the one language and a different way in a different language. And that just comes at like kind of a no cost to many, many families because we have such a multilingual, diverse families. Now, one thing I want to say, we focus so much on what parents can do, but since most of you have been parents, you can probably attest to the fact that parenting is stressful and really takes a lot of executive functioning and a lot of emotional regulation to be that good parent, right? And indeed, we're more and more in my lab looking at adults, wanting to know how their own executive functioning affect how well they parent and how well they teach. And so we published a few papers looking and showing that parental executive functioning really predict being less harsh and a reactive parent, being more sensitive, being more responsive, and also engaging in more of that cognitive scaffolding. So what we're hoping to start focusing more is at this 2-generational approach, maybe even 3-generational approach, where we really need to design intervention that look at self-regulation in both children and their caregivers, especially if they're parenting and teaching in very stressful contexts where these set of skills can be more taxed and undermined. Another thing that we want to try to encourage parents is to relax, right? It's easy to say, right? So maybe it doesn't look like this. Nowadays, maybe it looks more like this. But also just to not worry so much. And so along the side of just, it's easy to say relax, we have a little bit of piece of good news that I'm going to have Jenna tell you about.
Great. So we wondered, well, are all challenges bad? You know, if even just a little bit is that terrible for kids and going to make them fall apart? And so we started looking at the full range of emotional challenges in the home. And so we were looking at things like maybe parents arguing over who can pick a kid up at a soccer game when they both have work dinners, or somebody stressed because the pipe broke in the bathroom. And most people would assume that those types of things are probably, kids are going to make it just fine out of that. And those are normal challenges that they might experience in their home. And so we wondered, if you looked at this full range of challenges, from none at all the way up to more severe symptoms, how would this relate to children's executive functions? And what we found is this inverted U-shaped curve. And so we found that little bits of challenges, very mild, and this is in a community sample. So this is not a low-income sample who is experiencing high levels of adversity, but just very mild challenges, your everyday problems and squabbling and this and that, was linked to the highest levels of executive functions. And so the idea is that children who are in homes where they get to witness and see these small challenges get resolved, that's going to give them some practice and some ideas of what to do when they encounter challenges. And so when they're having to regulate their own behaviors and emotions, they've already seen how mom and dad work out who's going to pick them up from soccer when nobody has time, and it gives them some practice. And so small challenges are not bad for kids, and we don't need to constantly be protecting them from normal everyday things. Okay.
So another thing that we started doing is looking beyond executive functioning. We wanted to know, it's good to have a set of skills, right? It's good to have these set of skills, and they're really building blocks of a lot of competencies, and they translate well to different contexts, different cultural groups, different international setting. But we wanted to add 2 components, and that is motivation and emotion regulation. And the reason is, like, it's not enough to have a skills, it's also you want to be motivated to use those set of skills, right? And the other thing that we've noticed that in a real life settings, a lot of these challenges where these set of skills are relevant are emotionally laden, right? So there's not a lot that happens in the home environment or school environment that is not filtered to some kind of emotion. And so what we are trying to do next is we want to develop tasks that help us really understand how kids regulate their emotions, how well they're persisting when things are boring, how well they're persisting when things get challenging. We're also interested in how well they respond when they get frustrated or they get negative feedback. But we don't want to do it in a very typical way like developmental psychologists have done for many, many years, which is bring kids to the lab setting. We don't want to bring kids to the lab setting. And the reason for that is the lab settings are odd places to study children. They're not resembling the lifestyles and the kind of settings in which children need to practice that set of skills. So you saw the tasks that we use, and when a child comes into our lab, they meet and greet a very warm and welcoming researcher assistant. They get a lot of stickers, they get a lot of praise. While they're doing this task, the research assistant kind of sits on the side, but kind of a little bit looking over their shoulder. That is not a reality of children's life in the classrooms. We don't have one-to-one ratios in the classrooms, right? And so we got really frustrated by saying, we're not sure that we're getting the kind of ecological valid measures of how kids use these set of skills in the classrooms. So what we did, with the help of Stanford SFUSD partnership, which is supported by Phil and Maureen, we developed a large-scale study where we used these tablet-based computers, and we went to the classrooms, and we administered tasks to all of the kids at the same time, very similar to teachers administering a test. One of us would sit in front of the classroom, explain the rules, and kids had to do these tasks among their peers. And we now published and validated this assessment, showing that actually in some ways it's doing better in predicting achievement long-term than the one-to-one assessment that's very resembling the lab setting. So we're showing that this kind of group assessment, doing it in a classroom among their peers, is more beneficial. We also are now able, and Jenna is leading a paper, looking at how peers' executive functioning are affecting. So lifting the kind of pressure on teachers and parents, but understanding the context. Are you a really well-regulated child in a non-regulated classroom, or vice versa? And how peers can both promote and maybe undermine your development of executive functioning over time. But with the TLOS grant, which is another kind of a seed funding that we have here at GSC, we're currently expanding that to include direct measures of skills that I mentioned before: persistent, preferring challenging tasks. And the reason why we're so interested in preferring challenging tasks is because we have another paper that Jenna led where we look at the interaction of executive functioning and kids who are preferring to pick games or puzzles or solutions that are a little more difficult for them, that they're not just as good at, but they're choosing that over easy known things. And we see that these two things are both indicative of how well they're doing in classrooms as well as on achievement tests. So eventually, our goal is to really support kids in their learning endeavors. And one of the things that the kids need to do is when they come to classroom, they have to be biologically, but also behaviorally ready to learn. They have to be alert and focused and motivated, but they also have to have a way to bounce back when they encounter setbacks. And so we hope that we can reduce these educational disparity by finding the best ways to support children in achieving their developmental potential.